Who can say I am free? I have purified my great heart. There are none on earth. There are none on earth. I had no idea what I had invited by choosing to go to the movie that night by myself. I'm not even sure it was the movie that did it. It had been a French film, the plot of which I can't recall, beyond the mood that seeing it created in me, a mood of aloneness, of existential dread. It was a French film, after all. The timing and weather no doubt played a role, a weekday evening during a bleak post-holiday winter. I'd traveled on public transportation to and from the downtown Chicago theater, just another figure among unknown figures traveling from place to place, wearing the downtrodden expressions often seen among those riding mass transit. I was in my mid-20s, which probably contributed as well. I'm not sure I've ever felt as lost as I did then. I had some cockiness too, but I now understand that my 20-something chutzpah was a cover-up for how unsure of it all I really was. When I think of my regrets in life, many of them arose from the arrogance I carried in my 20s, how blind I could be to others' emotions and perspectives, how devoted I seemed to be to my own aggrandizement and self-preservation. I probably wasn't as oblivious or reckless as I'm making it sound. Neither was I nearly as alone as I might have been, certainly not as alone as many are. I had love in my life, good friendships too. I had work that paid the bills, waiting tables, teaching. I had artistic pursuits. I was not wealthy, but I did have resources that enabled me to be out that night to take in that depressing French film. Upon my return home, I had what I felt at the time was an emotional breakdown, but which I now know was a breakthrough. The circumstances of my outing that night had pulled me into an abyss from which I could finally see a difficult truth. I remember lying on my bed in my darkened apartment as I named this truth through tears and sobs. I named it to the ceiling. I named it to myself. I think I am better than other people, I said. I was not declaring that I was a better actor or a better friend or a better teacher or a better waiter or a better anything in particular. I knew I wasn't always better at navigating life's opportunities and challenges than those around me, just as I knew that in some cases I could be. I was acknowledging that night that I believed I was superior to others at my core, or at least that I was more important, maybe even more real than the people around me, that I was the central point around which the universe as I knew it revolved. I was admitting how I had been thinking of myself and behaving as the protagonist in a cosmic play, as the sympathetic, always remarkable, always forgivable, leading man, surrounded by supporting players who either understood my script and therefore acted well, and those who didn't and were therefore seen, by me at least, as bad actors. I think I am better than other people, I cried, and I'm not. I am not. I could see that night how the text of the play in which I had cast myself as the lead had been created mostly through my expectations, most of which I hadn't consciously chosen. How many of the expectations that we have of life originate solely with us? We all emerge and develop as individuals from countless circumstances that we did not choose. The genetic code we carry, the conditions of culture and class that surround us, the multi-generational family emotional process out of which and through which we grow, the myriad privileges and disadvantages that help make us who we are. I've heard it said that the personality each of us inhabits is an expression of the strategy we have employed for getting out of childhood alive. Think of that. My personality, your personality, the personalities of all those in this room and those beyond it are the expressions of the strategies we have employed for getting out of childhood alive, no matter how old we are when we finally emerge. All the ways we have put ourselves above others, as well as the ways we may have resigned ourselves to being beneath others, all of the behaviors and the relational quirks that make us who we are, all of the ways we tend to meet expectations that others have of us and that we have of ourselves, and all the ways we don't, all of these are in large part the products of the very things we have done and become in order to survive. The night of my breakthrough, I could not yet grasp that my inflated sense of self was also a component of my humanity, of my own need to survive, and that I wasn't really all that unique in seeing myself as the center of the universe. I just knew that my realization that night had left me feeling awful, with a gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. I knew I wanted things to be different. I knew I was being called by life to make a turn. I knew that I wanted to open myself to a new way of being, even if it were painful, even if I weren't sure how to get there, even if I had to let go of some of my protective armor in order to open my heart. A new heart I will give, not stone, but one that frees. A new heart I will give, one that frees. Have you had moments in your life when you too have had to acknowledge that you may have been putting yourself above other people? That you have cast yourself as the star, expecting everyone else to be your supporting players? Perhaps in those moments of realization, you too have been brought to tears. Maybe you've had to acknowledge that you've contributed to the circumstances you inhabit, that your view of others was keeping you from being the kind of person you most want to be. Maybe in those moments, you too were being called by life to make a turn, unsure of how to do it, unsure if it would help. When I think of these moments, I'm reminded of the wisdom of my psychiatrist friend, Earl Fitz, who would often share, "What's wrong with you is what's right with you." What's wrong with you, he would say, is what's right with you. Especially, I add, if it leads you to new ways of seeing the world and new ways of being in it. This is where I now know my own moment would take me. I was still a few years away from discovering Unitarian Universalism and finding for myself a faith and a religious community from which I could be called to question my own feelings of superiority, called to see my neighbors, even amidst our differences, as equally important members of one human family, called to be open to life, expecting to love, prepared to serve. I was still a few years from accepting the covenant, the promise, if you will, that we share here of affirming and promoting the interdependent web of existence, compassion in human relations, and most vital for my message today, the inherent worth and dignity of all individuals, you and me. When we speak about affirming inherent worth and dignity as a component of our UU faith, aren't we suggesting that not only the lovely, compassionate aspects of ourselves have worth and dignity, but also the self-centered, the selfish, the negative, even the repulsive qualities as well? If we truly affirm inherent worth and dignity of all individuals, you and me, how can we not uphold the possibility that we could forgive ourselves and each other? How can we not see ourselves as potential supporting players for everybody else? Understanding that the survival instinct we have to view ourselves as deserving champions when things go well and as victims when they do not is, in fact, an inherent aspect of the human condition itself. If we all have worth and dignity, aren't we all worthy of forgiveness? Whenever we start talking about inherent worth and dignity, and therefore our inherent responsibility to make amends when we have done wrong, to forgive when we believe others have done us wrong, our minds often go to the most dramatic challenges we can think of. Well, what about Nazis, or pedophiles, or mass murderers, or terrorists? What about ISIS, we say? What about torture? We know our fellow humans sometimes perpetuate in or participate in horrible acts that are beyond the scope of our understanding in their disrespect, in their violence, in their very violation of the inherent worth and dignity that we say we seek to affirm and promote. Sadly, tragically, some of us have had our lives directly impacted by such acts. And we have had to discern, each in our ways, how to live through the aftermath. This morning, I do not seek to minimize the challenges that any of us have faced. And I don't want to imply that all acts themselves are forgivable. I'm not even sure that all people are forgivable, given the horrendous things we know that humans do. Still, I continue to appreciate words I've heard from Bill Scholes, a former president of our UU Association, who also served for 12 years as the executive director of Amnesty International, a role that offered him a global view of the way human rights can be denied. Scholes said, after what he has observed, he no longer accepts the promotion of inherent worth of humans based on some vague notion that aliveness itself is good, or some long outdated hierarchical assumption that because human beings represent the pinnacle of aliveness, we inherently possess some kind of merit. He says he doesn't buy that anymore. He says, however, he has decided that he must assign worth and dignity to everyone in order to preserve his own. He must assign it to preserve his own. The necessity to assign worth and dignity to others in order to preserve our own, the necessity to accept that forgiveness is something we can assign as well, speaks to me. It speaks of how we can rarely understand in full the circumstances and motivations of those around us. It acknowledges and honors the reality that even in the midst of the most despicable behavior, there, but for the grace of God, or genetics, or privilege, or education, or good timing, or plain dumb luck, go I. The day-to-day challenges most of us face are not of the despicable, unforgivable kind, even if we may treat them that way. Thankfully, most of us have much more mundane struggles with our connections and disconnections. Here's a story of one of these mundane encounters. You've probably seen things like this all the time. I offer it for its simplicity, with the expectation that you perhaps could see it as a metaphor for the more complex encounters that may be troubling you. I was in line at McDonald's the other day. A woman a line over had ordered several Happy Meals, for which she had apparently also ordered ice cream. When the cashier brought her the first ice cream cone, the customer snapped back, "I told you I wanted it in a dish." The cashier, trained, I am sure, to not roll her eyes, even when she is being talked down to, calmly went to retrieve a plastic bowl into which she placed the ice cream with the cone sticking out on top. Upon being handed the bowl, the customer responded, "That's not what I want." The cashier said, "Well, this is how we serve a cone in a dish." The customer barked back, "How about you give me what I ordered? How about that?" The customer shook her head dismissively and looked around for support from her fellow customers. It mattered not that the cashier had delivered what she thought was the right order. What the cashier offered was not what had been expected, and the customer's feelings of superiority led her to be abusive in her response. As I watched this exchange unfold, I tried to view the participants with compassionate eyes. I'll admit that I related more to the cashier, wondering if she had wanted to lash back at the woman, impressed that she hadn't really. I thought of the customer, too, of what was going on in her day or in her life that had enabled her to speak to the cashier with such disdain. I thought of all the times I've let my own expectations negatively impact my exchanges with others, how I've been empowered by my own felt superiority in the moment to be demanding, how I've felt belittled when others have sought to impose their similar feelings of superiority on me. I'd say, in most of our negative encounters with others, presumed superiority by one or both participants is the primary problem most of the time. Not seeing each other as equals, as worthy of understanding and forgiveness, and thereby assigning blame as a means to discern accountability. That's the problem. Much of the time, our reactivity to what we feel others have done or not done is what negatively complicates our lives. I'm not saying bad things have not happened as a result of what others do. And I'm not saying we don't have a right to seek retribution or even justice when lines of accountability have been crossed. I'm saying that how we choose to view what's happening has a lot to do with the outcomes that will follow. Here's an idea that may open up for you the possibility of a new functioning position in the relationships and encounters of your life, an idea that may help you emerge from the abyss that opens when you realize you are not the person you most want to be, when you are being called by life to let go of your feelings of superiority or victimhood, but you just aren't sure how to do it. The idea is called being the bored. I read about it in a book by Roz and Benjamin Zander entitled The Art of Possibility. When we look at disappointing encounters and relationships in our lives, the first thing we often do is to seek to establish that we are in the right, that someone has done something that caused whatever circumstance in which we find ourselves. Well, I wouldn't have had to be so rude about that ice cream, we say, if that cashier had not been so incompetent. Or I wouldn't despise my job at McDonald's so much if it weren't for the demanding, disrespectful customers. But rather than assign blame to others, we could accept responsibility for the experience we are having. Rather than see ourselves as the pawn of another, we can often choose to be the board upon which the entire game is taking place. For example, if we're the cashier, or if we're the customer, we could say, I'm in a busy McDonald's right now. The cashier obviously could not hear me. I could have been more clear in my communication. Or the cashier could think, this customer is navigating McDonald's with several children, some of whom might not eat their ice cream if it arrives with a cone in it. I could be patient. This choosing to be the board practice, overly simplified by that example, I know, This choosing to be the board practice does not change the truth. It helps us to see the truth. It changes our relationship to the truth. It changes the choices we have in the midst of the truth. As an illustration of how being the board has helped him, Ben Zander tells the story of a time when he was conducting the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, which is a community orchestra of mostly volunteers and students, but a renowned orchestra all the same. Ben is the conductor. Pressure was mounting as they were nearing the date of an upcoming concert, which would be recorded for a CD release. For one of the final rehearsals, Ben knew he was going to be missing several viola players, which would all but ruin a key component of the piece they would be rehearsing that night. When an important viola player named Cora also didn't show up for this rehearsal without warning, he thought, he was furious. How could she miss such a vital rehearsal without telling him? So during a break in the rehearsal, he found her elsewhere in the conservatory chatting with a couple of other students. He says he stormed in and shouted at her, "Cora, don't you know we have a rehearsal going on?" She calmly replied, "I told another player I wouldn't be there." Her nonchalance infuriated him even more. He asked her to come to the second half of the rehearsal, and again she said no, that she had a coaching session. Ben barked at Cora and the women she was with. "Doesn't look like a coaching session to me," and stormed off. Cora showed up at the end of the rehearsal, saying coldly that she was resigning from the orchestra, that she would not accept being abused. Ben responded with irritation. "Oh, Cora, don't be silly. I wasn't abusing you. We're just under pressure. So many people are missing." Cora held her ground. "I can't help that." And she walked out. Ben's way of relating to the situation had made it far worse now. He talked through his options with his wife, Roz, who happens to be a psychiatrist. How convenient. She suggested to him that he could choose to be the board, explaining to him, "You can always grace yourself with responsibility for anything that happens in your life. You can always find within yourself the source of any problem that you have." "That's ridiculous," Ben said. "I couldn't have stopped her from walking out. Anyway, I have too many things to think about. I can't be responsible for everything every player does. I have a concert to prepare." Roz offered back that she wasn't suggesting that he blame himself, but that he view the circumstances anew by acknowledging what led to Cora's walkout, that he could take responsibility for his participation in that. After some thought, Ben chose to write Cora a letter expressing that the exchange with her had helped him to see that his habit of getting angry and sarcastic when things didn't go as he expected was irreparably damaging his relationships. He shared his gratitude that she decided to leave, painful though it was, because it had offered him a timely reminder that he cannot assume that others share his priorities and that his relationships to his colleagues are more important, after all, than his expectations. He said he learned his relationships to his colleagues are more important than his expectations. Then he wished her well and thanked her again for helping him see things from a new perspective. He had chosen to be the board. Cora returned to the orchestra. She had not been manipulated to return. She had been engaged as someone worthy to return, and so she did. Ben chose to acknowledge how what had taken place was not just happening to him or by him, but through him, and therefore he could create a framework for a potentially different outcome by choosing to be the board. If we are seeing ourselves as pieces on the board, as pawns, as knights, as kings or queens, perhaps, maybe even as the only player of the game seeking to control all the pieces on the board. Our first instinct when trouble arises will be to look for fault, to succumb to pronouncements of what others should have done. We become too eager to teach others the errors of their ways, and if they don't want to hear the lessons we have to offer, we use their resistance as more fuel for our self-righteous fire. If we change our view to see ourselves as the board itself, the place where the game is being played, we can open up new perspectives for ourselves. We don't change the truth. We change our relationship to the truth. In this way, if we look more deeply into what is happening through the question, how did this thing that I am having trouble with get on the board that I am? We will discover, perhaps, that we have sacrificed a relationship to maintain our feelings of being better or more important or more blameless than another. And then, as the relationship breaks down, so might the possibility that a new way to be together could be found. Opening to this idea that we are the board upon which our life is taking place is not easy. It asks of us a lot more responsibility for our behavior than we are typically willing to have. It requires that we leave space for those around us, that we assume good intentions. When we are being the board, we have to monitor the stories we are crafting about other people's behavior or incompetence or insensitivity, and that can feel risky to us. When we are being the board, we are not confirming that everyone around us is automatically beyond blame. We are simply acknowledging that assigning blame as a first step will lead us to be ineffective toward having deeply connected relationships with our companions, the connected relationships that we still could have, the relationships in which we don't see ourselves as inherently better or more important than other people, the relationships in which we seek to understand more than to teach, the relationships in which we see our disappointments that we encounter as invitations to growth and new possibility, the relationships that can grow when we are called by life and we, with respect, worth, and dignity for ourselves and for our companions, answer the call. The relationships that grow when we are called by life and we answer the call. May this day make us strong, like a tree of life with good fruit. Bless us now, amen. Bless us now, amen. May we now forgive, atone that we may live. May we now forgive that we may live. Amen.